Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. A great turnout, um, and you're in for a great conversation with Elizabeth Weitzman. It's really a pleasure to have her here. She's a prolific author and critic who has written over 24 books for children and young adults on topics ranging from Stonehenge to parenting, and of course a bunch on film and television. She's also a leading film critic who has written for The Village Voice, Harper's Bazaar, and Interview Magazine, all the best gigs there are. She was the film critic for the New York Daily News for 15 years, and she's currently the film critic for The Wrap. She has served on juries of every festival around the world. She's interviewed just about everyone there is to interview. And in 2015, The Hollywood Reporter named her as one of the top critics in New York. Her latest book, which we'll talk about today, is Renegade Women in Film and Television. It's a really beautifully produced book. So thanks so much for coming to Penn to talk to us.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for being here.
Elizabeth has laryngitis.
I do. I apologize in advance. I've never had this before. But like Peter said, hopefully I will forget about it in a few minutes.
And she said none of the women in the book would have allowed laryngitis to prevent them from talking to you, so she's not going to do that either.
We're forging through.
So yes, such a beautiful book.
Thank
my
you.
first question is just, why write this book now?
Well, that's actually a great question. I wrote it before there was a Me Too movement, or I should say I pitched it before there was a Me Too movement or Time's Up movement. But we had started to talk a lot more about how underrepresented women have always been in entertainment. And that is great. I'm so glad that we're talking about it. But that approach is only half the story. And so the other half of the story was getting left behind. Because the truth is, there have always been women in entertainment, and there have always been women sort of on this parallel track that we're not even aware of. It's not that we're sort of now just bringing women into a man's field. It's that the women have always been there, but for one reason or another, and there's, in fact, with 50 women, there's 50 different reasons in this particular book, but for one reason or another, they found themselves on a shadow track. And so I wanted to let everybody know that actually women aren't underrepresented to the degree that we think they are. And we should know about these women, and we should celebrate them and their work.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's amazing is there are people here, superstars from every aspect of the industry, from producers to actors to critics. So who did you know had to be in here right away? And then what were the surprises, people you didn't even think about and then happened upon?
Okay, so the first part of that question was so hard because I really and truly, as you know, I could have included 1,000 women. I mean, that's the good news, is there's so many women who could have been in this book. And I originally pitched it actually as 100 women, all in film. And then my editor said, okay, you can have 50 women, and half of them have to be in TV and half of them have to be in film. So I had 25 women from my original field, and it was hard for me to start with the original 100. So it was very tough. But I knew Alice Guy Blaché, of course, had to be in there. I'm sure you guys may be familiar with her, but most people aren't. She's not a household name, which is insane, but also speaks to this shadow track that I'm talking about. She was, I hate to even call her the first female filmmaker, because that also puts her on a track where she doesn't deserve to be. She was one of the very first filmmakers. Many historians think she made the very first fictional film, certainly was one of them, and she defined cinema really as we know it today, and yet nobody's ever heard of her. So there are some superstars in here, but also people that should be superstars still.
Yeah. Were the people that were surprises to you?
Oh, yes. Okay, so I think maybe, I don't know how to choose, but one of my favorite chapters in the book is a woman named Nazimova. Is anybody here familiar with her? Okay. Yes, other than the film professor. So Nazimova was, in 1920, the highest paid actor, male or female, in America, and one of the absolute most revered icons. Everyone knew her name. She was so famous, she was like Madonna. Like, she went by one name. She was just called Nazimova. Everybody knew her. She also happened to be an openly feminist, queer Jewish immigrant in 1920. mean, she was pushing boundaries that we're still navigating today, and we don't even know her name. Why? That's sort of also what I wanted to get at, is why don't we know? Do we know Hitchcock? Do we know Orson Welles? And we don't know Nazimova, and we don't know Guy Blaché.
Yeah. So why are they forgotten? Why does it become a shadow history?
Well, that's a good question, and I'll be talking more about that later. But I will say, a lot of it, I think, is what I call the subjectivity of history, which I know professors talk a lot about too. We think that we are getting the facts when someone tells us a story, especially nonfiction. But the truth is, every storyteller is a gatekeeper of some kind, and they're telling you the story as they understand it, or as they see it, or as they want it to be. And Alice is actually a great example of this. So she lived to be 94 years old, which meant that she got to watch the first histories of film being written in her lifetime. They were all written by men, and she was omitted from all of them. At best, she got one sentence where she was a footnote shoved onto that shadow track as the first female filmmaker, which instantly means she is not a peer to everyone else. And that was at best. In general, she was forgotten completely in her own lifetime. Now, of course, the first texts then become the reference for every subsequent text. So we go down the line through the generations, and what started out, when someone might have started out in a spotlight, and Alice was very famous, in her heyday in, sort of 1900 to 1920, everyone knew who she was. But then they started writing these texts, and Hollywood became a more rigid place that had more rules and more gatekeepers. And so she was shut out, and so the spotlight grew narrower, and the shadow track got bigger. And so now the texts keep going, and at best, we think of her as the first female filmmaker, and oh, isn't that nice? We should remember her. But really, she defined cinema. Before, can I teach like a little Alice lesson? It's so important that we also actually be the gatekeepers, because we do have the choice as to which stories we tell. And Alice is a story that I really want to tell, and if you guys tell it, then we'll pull her out of the shadows a little bit more. We have the power to do that. And so she made what many consider to be the very first fictional film at the time. Other filmmakers were really using, they weren't even really filmmakers. They were using moving pictures to document things, to document a parade or a train or a really great college talk, for example. And that was pretty much it. And she said to her boss, you know what, I feel like I can do more than this. And she was actually his secretary. He was working in film. And he said, as long as it doesn't interfere with your secretarial duties, go ahead and play around with the camera. And that's how she made this film. She went on to make over 1,000 more movies in every genre, often literally inventing the genre as she went. She started, one of the very first film studios. I mean, she mentored so many other filmmakers. Filmmakers like Agnes Varda and Hitchcock were influenced by her, and yet we know Hitchcock and Varda's names, but we don't know her. So,
yeah, and actually, just because you're talking about Alice so much, maybe you want to plug the new recent film about her.
Oh yes, there's a terrific.
You're writing at the same time as so many other people are starting to recover this history. So there's a film about her. There's a bunch of other films that are coming out about similar topics.
Yes, that's true. It is a really good time right now for people to kind of step up and be a different sort of gatekeeper, or decide who else gets invited into the gates or pulled out of that shadow track, whichever metaphor we want to use. Mm-hmm. But there is a new film out called Be Natural. It's awesome. Has anybody seen it yet? Well, I highly recommend it. And are there any journalism or nonfiction students here today? Excellent. All right, so just as an example, since it is a writer's house, when you talk about the power that we have to be gatekeepers, I knew in advance that Be Natural was coming out, so I just pitched the New York Times on an article about Alice and about the movie, And so, I don't know how many more, but certainly once that article ran, that many more people then knew about Alice and knew about the movie. So it's really a communal effort to kind of change the way history is told.
Yeah. So actually talking about yourself as a critic, I was wondering if you connected or had for a long time felt like you were following the footsteps of some of the critics who were in here. People like Pauline Kael or Molly Haskell.
That's really interesting. I mean, I would say of anybody, probably, I guess it would be Molly Haskell. Has anyone read From Reverence to Rape? Okay, I mean, it is a classic in feminist and in film studies, but it's sort of being forgotten a little bit. And I've found when I've talked to some film schools, like students will read, for example, a book like Easy Rider's Raging Bulls, which talks all about how great the 60s and 70s were in film, but they won't read Molly Haskell's book From Reverence to Rape, which is about how crappy that time actually was for anyone who wasn't represented on screen, which really was hundreds of millions of people. So I love that Molly Haskell was really the first person, or not the first person, but one of the first people to publicly say, hey, wait a minute, there's another story out there and nobody's talking about it. And it's really important. And when I read her, that sort of opened my mind, like, there's totally another story. There's a billion stories out there, and we're hearing the same few over and over. So yeah, definitely. And I was lucky enough, I actually interviewed Molly. There's like there's sort of a mix of biographies and interviews, but one of the interviews is with Molly because she's such an inspiration and she has so much to say to us still, for sure.
Yeah, no, still an active and terrific
totally.
critic. There's actually a new edition of From Reverence to Rape that came out. Yeah.
And she writes other books, and of course her husband was also a very famous film critic, Andrew Sarris, as well. So
yeah, amazing. So something you were alluding to earlier is that so many of these women were already really influential in the industry, who ran studios, who were directors, and yet we forget them. And they're not only women, but women of color, queer women. How is it that we think it's such a male-dominated industry when there's this long history?
Well, I mean, isn't that incredible that we do think that when it's not, it's just not the case. And again, I hate to repeat it, but I think it goes back to the gatekeepers. I think it goes back to the professors. What are they teaching students who then go on to become professors and teach the same thing that they've learned?
No, and so many of them were fighting battles, not just within the industry, but legal battles, right? Against, Anna May Wong couldn't kiss her leading men because of miscegenation laws. That amazing story that I didn't know, that Hattie McDaniel, when she won the Oscar, was sitting at a segregated table.
Right. Okay. So Hattie McDaniel is most famous for being in Gone with the Wind, and when we look at that film now, I mean, we really can see that it was such a demeaning role. She plays a servant who really is just a few steps up from a slave on a plantation in the South. I don't know how many people have actually seen Gone with the Wind. It used to be like a must-see, and now I think people are kind of reconsidering it. So now things have changed where people assumed that Hattie McDaniel was, they associated her with that character when really that was all she was offered. If she wanted to work, that was what she had to take. And if you look at her films, you see that actually she makes political statements in every single one of her films, with her acting choices when she can't do it, with her dialogue. She was really put down so harshly, and it hurt her terribly because people didn't realize that she had to fight such systemic racism, and she changed so much demeaning dialogue that people weren't even aware of. And then she won the Oscar, and Hollywood and the media, they wanted everyone to see this great image of her holding up, a black woman holding up an Oscar. Nobody took a picture of her sitting at the table in the back, alone with her date and her manager, because she wasn't allowed to sit with everyone else. So no one even knows that. So that's why it's just so important to widen the spotlight so we know more about these stories.
Yeah. I'm curious, are there other stories that people have really been shocked by when you travel and tell them?
Oh, well, I will say, Nazimova is the one that everybody is really stunned by, but something that a lot of people are surprised by, is how hard it was for Barbra Streisand, and how much crazy sexism she has faced. And once you realize it, you'll notice that she continues to face. It took her, I think, 16 years to get Yentl made. She was the #1 box office star, the biggest star in the world, right? Like the biggest star. And she could not get this movie made. And she was treated like, she says it I interviewed her too. She was treated like, she says, like this little, airheaded actress and singer who was guided by men in her career. And meanwhile, she's like, no, I can do this. This is my passion project. Of course, the movie ended up becoming a classic. She became the first and still the only woman to win a Best Director Golden Globe. But throughout her career, if you notice, whenever you read about Barbra Streisand, people use words like diva and difficult, and they talk a lot about her temperament. I mean, it is part of who she is, right? And certainly, I didn't experience any of that with her. I mean, she is one of the biggest stars in the world. She did not have to say yes, to this book, and she was happy to do it, and she couldn't have been nicer. And when I mentioned that to her, she said, words like diva, words like difficult, what does that actually mean? Well, men get words like passionate. Women get words like controlling. And she said, I would love to leave people, when we talked about the interview, and I said, what do you want people to know? She said, I just want people to look at language and how people use language or wield language, because it makes a difference. Is she a diva? Is she difficult? I mean, no more than Robert Redford was, and yet nobody was using those words for him. And that's followed her everywhere. Yeah. So, even still today.
Yeah. No, every one of these stories is amazing about the struggle to get films made, which end up being some of the most powerful and celebrated films. So there's actually, in some ways, two stories about what's happening now. Some people say, and some of the interview subjects say, things are finally starting to change. But then also at the same time, there's all this evidence that 3 men speak for every woman.
Yeah.
If you look at the number of films being made, only out of 1,000 films, 40 of them are made by women.
Yeah, right. No, that's absolutely true. Out of the top, this is in the book, but out of the top 1,100 films made in the decade between 2007, 2017, anyone want to guess how many were made by women? The answer is 43 out of over 1,000. One woman has won a Best Director Oscar, and she won it 10 years ago. So again, this is all about how we see. When you look at numbers like that, the natural conclusion is 43 out of 1,000, one woman out of 90 years. Maybe women just aren't as good at making movies as men are. But then you go back and you look at the story from a totally different perspective, right? You look at what women were doing, not from 2007 to 2017, but before the gatekeepers arrived in Hollywood and realized there was money to be made and the status quo to be established. When Hollywood was like the Wild West and there were no rules, women were all over the place. I mean, they were making fully 50% of the movies in Hollywood were written, were directed by women, in the early years. And then it became clear to businessmen that this was a money-making venture. And structures were formed and hierarchies were built and gates were closed. So how could it be that all of these women were so great at making films before the gates were up? And how could it be that whenever we open the gates, people flood through? And still be true that women just aren't as good at it. There's another story. There's so many other stories there.
Yeah. So are the gates opening now or not? And if
Yes.
they are, how and why?
The gates are definitely opening, which is great news. So I pitched this book in 2016, which is not a long time ago. Since Time's Up has only happened since then, right? So movies that were being made then are coming out now. So I really am hopeful that, we have a whole new generation of actors and filmmakers who are speaking out and who are supporting each other. And so I am hopeful that we are going to see more and more. But I can give you a specific example right now. Ava DuVernay, who I'm sure everyone is a fan of, right? I mean, she's one of our great filmmakers. She was heavily influenced by a woman named Julie Dash. Is anyone here, other than Peter, I know, familiar with Julie Dash? Okay. Have you seen Daughters of the Dust? It's one of the absolute great films of the 20th century, right? No one has seen it. No one knows about it except in film school. Julie Dash was the first African-American woman to get a nationally released feature film in 1991. And it took her 10 years to get that movie made. And meanwhile, it has since gone on to become one of the all-time classic films in cinema. And it heavily influenced so many artists who came after her, like Beyonce, who references a lot in Lemonade, but also Ava DuVernay. And so what DuVernay did when she became a gatekeeper was open the gates herself. She didn't just walk through them, she opened them wider. Has anyone seen her show on OWN, Queen Sugar? It's a terrific show. I highly recommend it. And she committed that every director of every episode would be a woman. Now, some people said, well, how can you do that? That's discrimination. But every director of most shows is a man, and nobody thinks twice about it. It's not unusual, right? So she decided she was going to take women like Julie Dash, who were unable, even after this great success, this artistic success of Daughters of the Dust, were unable to get other work. Patricia Cardoza, so many women who were able to maybe get one film through and then just couldn't do any more. And so she decided, I'm going to hire these women. And so if you watch Queen Sugar, basically the roster of that show is, you could look at that and say, okay, here's all the women whose films I need to see. And as a result, she's not doing that as a favor. I mean, as a result, Queen Sugar is a spectacularly cinematic television show in a way that very few TV shows are. So.
No, it's an amazing that Julie Dash didn't have a more prolific career.
It's unbelievable.
I have a colleague who taught a course on African American first features because there's such a long list of filmmakers who made these breakthrough features and then just couldn't have a career afterwards.
Yeah, she's been trying to get a sequel to Daughters of the Dust made for like 20 years. This is a movie that every film studies student sees, that anybody truly interested in cinema sees. It's an incredible film. Highly recommend. It's on Netflix, by the way. If you're interested, it's a difficult film, I think, to see. It reminded me sort of when I read Ulysses. I was so glad that I did it in school, with a text and a professor. And I feel like Daughters of the Dust is so complex that it's the kind of thing that's great to see. She also, though, wrote a companion book, which if you do see it, you can just get that on Amazon, and I would highly recommend reading that first. But it's worth seeing.
I mean, it's a film that you shouldn't watch on your phone on Netflix. We should
Right.
arrange a screening at the
Totally.
writer's house.
That would be amazing.
Yeah, it's one of these films that really rewards watching it with an audience and a big screen.
Yeah.
I will say this is a book that rewards being bought in hardback.
Thank you.
It's such a beautiful book with these amazing illustrations. And I will just mention, I should have said at the beginning, but they're on sale in the back room too. So pick one up on the way out.
Happy to sign it for you.
Why did you decide to use illustrations and work with an illustrator? And just tell us about the process of producing it.
Oh, sure. So I actually love old photos, which I guess is not surprising for someone who loves film. But I really wanted to go back all the way to the beginning of film, and there weren't very many. So I wasn't sure. I didn't want to be limited to kind of what was in the public domain. And then I started kind of messing around. I don't know if there's any artists here, but there's a website called Women Who Draw. Is anyone familiar with it? Well, if anyone here is an artist or interested in art, it's an incredible site, and I became obsessed with it. And I looked at just literally like 1,000 portfolios. And then I asked, maybe a dozen women if they would send me a sample. They could choose one of the women and send a sample. And this young woman who really hadn't done much, her name was Austin Claire Clemens, and she sent me her picture of Edith Head, who was a costume designer. And when I saw it, I was like, this is it. She's the one, and this is the way we should do it. And on her own, actually, something that I love. Nobody told her to do this. She just did it. She put a wallpaper, and there's all these Easter eggs of the women's lives and careers in the wallpaper. So, and some of them aren't even in the book. Like, for example, Dorothy Arzner, who is another incredible story, she invented the boom mic. And unfortunately, when I was editing, I had to cut so much down. It killed me that I couldn't mention that because it's a big deal. But it turned out that Austin had put that in her wallpaper. So she gets a little credit for it.
Yeah. So who was the hardest one to leave out?
Oh my gosh. What a great question. Okay, so...
And at the end, there is a little list
okay, so I will tell you, I was so, like, I couldn't, I was so distraught that I was like, please, can I have, like, another little section where I could just include some more people? And so I did. I had this little section, which was not originally going to be in the book, called Still More Renegade Women. And, you know, there's so, I mean, any one of these women, Jenny Louise Van Der Zee, no one knows her name, but a lot of people think that she was the very first female African-American filmmaker. Her story's been almost lost to time. Mabel Normand, I mean, if I get to do a volume 2, Mabel Normand will definitely be in it. I mean, everybody knows Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin. Well, you know, Mabel Normand discovered Charlie Chaplin, mentored Charlie Chaplin, directed him, worked with everybody. Nobody knows who she is. Everybody knows all of their films. Betty Davis, you know, Betty Davis is somebody who's sort of like Barbra Streisand, I think, in that she's gotten, how would I say this? Like, the way that she's been written about and portrayed is so inaccurate and so unfair. I don't know, did anybody see what was that show called?
Yeah,
the Ryan Murphy show, where it was Betty Davis and Joan Crawford.
What's it called? The Struggle or something.
Yeah, I forget what it was called, but it was when they were on the set of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. And that is the image of Betty Davis as like this wild-eyed, crazy old lady that just like, you know, is insane. Well, meanwhile, and I don't want to leave any of her accomplishments out here, so I'm even going to just refer to it, but, you know, she was the first female president of the Academy. She was the first person to earn 11 Oscar nominations. She founded the Hollywood Canteen for Soldiers, which is an incredible project that nobody even knows about anymore. You know, and she spoke out. She was one of the few people to speak out really loudly against McCarthyism, which was an incredibly brave thing to do at the time. It could have destroyed her. And she spoke out for the ERA when a lot of people in Hollywood, most people in Hollywood, were, you know, encouraged not to get political. She was an amazing woman, and people just don't know it. So I guess what I would love to do is sort of maybe do another volume where I subvert the images that we have of certain icons. That would be kind of fun.
No, the misunderstood renegade women.
Yeah, that would be cool. I feel like Dorothy Dandridge is another one of those, to the degree that she's even remembered. I don't know if anybody is familiar with her. You know, yes, some people are. So, you know,
her biographer teaches a course here. So.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Okay, so she was sort of thought of as just a beautiful woman. You know, she was a black woman. She won an Oscar, or she was nominated for an Oscar. She didn't win, but she was actually, I think she was the first African American actor to be nominated for a lead Oscar, which is a big deal. Right? And yet she was treated the same way. In addition, there's so much racism that she had to deal with. It was unbelievable. I'm sort of going, there's so many tangents on Dorothy Dandridge that I want to tell you about. So I'll start here and say that in many, many places, she was the very first person to integrate the cities that she traveled to. Halle Berry actually did a movie, and there's about her. And there's a famous scene in which the hotel drained and closed the pool rather than allow her to use it. And the other people who were using it were the people who were coming to see her show that night. You know, she was there as a performer, and yet they asked her to use the back elevator or to stay. She was also, you know, a singer, a great singer. And so she did a lot of performances that way as well as acting. And so she would perform in hotels. That was a big thing at the time. And so even when she was performing in a hotel, they would ask her to stay off-site because the hotel was segregated. And it was unbelievably brave of her to say, no, if you don't want me in your hotel, then you don't want me in your hotel. And I'm not going to perform here. And it took a tremendous toll on her. I mean, you can imagine that much racism, that much hatred, the threat of violence always hanging over her head. And then also, because she was seen really only as a sex symbol, she was stunningly beautiful. So she was seen really only as a sex symbol. And like another sex symbol in the book, Hattie Lamar, and actually in Anna May Wong, another sex symbol, it really took a toll on her too, because she was a brilliant woman. She had so much to say. And all anybody wanted to do was look at her. And she died very young. It's actually one of the sadder stories in the book. But by telling her story and seeing her movies, we can honor her still today.
So I want to be able to open it up and give everyone a chance to ask questions about the writing process and being a critic, or about the book in particular, or your favorite women in film and TV. Yeah.
I have a question. So you seem to have had a very diverse career. What hurdles have you faced as a woman, and how have you overcome those hurdles in getting your work published?
Oh, wow, that's an interesting question. And I will be honest with you, I haven't really thought about it. I've been so focused on, I don't know, speaking for the voiceless, I guess, that I think I've actually been very lucky. I've had a lot of incredible mentors, both male and female. Peter and I went to the same film studies program, and the teachers were great. But I will say 99% of them were men. And you know what? Here's a hurdle that I would say. This is maybe not sort of a direct answer, but I feel like it does answer the question. When I was in film school, for every course I took, and I don't know if this was true for you, it was almost always taught by a man, but also we heard about one woman. And so I got the idea that like these women were the exception to the rule, right? So I thought, okay, there was one woman in the avant-garde, which is not remotely true. Or, there was one major female film critic. And so when, that passes on, and I think you take that in, and it's not good for anyone to believe that kind of bias. And I had to do a lot of unlearning, I think, in that regard. So personally, I've been very, very lucky. I've worked with incredible men and women. But I definitely think that my education was limited.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think we were there at a moment when the story was starting to change, and it always is, right? We're always going back and rewriting history with a view of the present. But I was a research assistant for Antonia Land, who was writing The Red Velvet Seat, a kind of pioneering encyclopedia of women in the industry.
That must have been incredible.
Yeah. But as you were saying, it was actually really hard to do the research.
Yeah,
You don't go to the
That's
main,
right.
You don't go to the main resources. You have to really start to look outside the traditional realm of text you would look at in order to start to recover this history.
And now we have that text, which I used. So there you go.
Actually, to follow up on, I'm a librarian, so I'm always interested in the research project that goes into these kinds of books. Can you say a few words? Like, were there certain sources that real gold mines for you, or certain figures that you could find out nothing about, or how did it play out for you?
Yeah, there were certain people who there's almost nothing written about. June Mathis, who was a writer, an incredible screenwriter and producer in the silent era. There is she's like disappeared. Nobody is even certain of when she was born. I mean, her obituary was on the front page of the New York Times. Okay, and now we know nothing about her. And so when I was writing her chapter, I thought, well, should I leave it out because I know so little? And then I thought, well, no, because what good will that do? So, I did my best to talk about, when I couldn't talk about the specifics as we knew them, I was able to talk about other things. But I will say that by far, as a librarian, the best sources I had were the original sources. For example, Alice Guy Blaché watched herself written out of history. She was in really none of the texts. Nobody talked about her. And she was pissed. She was really she could not believe it. And so she wrote to everybody and she asked them to include her, and nobody did. Nobody did. Not even her boss, Leon Gaumont. I mean, nobody did. She couldn't believe it. And she was a feisty lady. She was in her 80s, and she was like, fine, forget it. If you're not going to do it, I'm going to do it. And so she wrote her own memoirs, which, by the way, are spectacular. They are hilarious and they are witty, and she pulls no punches. So really, you kind of get a better sense from her. Now, I mean, the sad thing is that unfortunately they were not published until after she died, but she was able to keep her story going, and so now we're able to do that too.
Gertrude Berg is someone else, kind of forgotten, but just recently people are starting to. There's a Gertrude Berg.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, there's a film about
yeah,
the
she's in here.
Goldbergs.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a fun film.
Yes.
Yeah, You Who, Mrs. Goldberg, it's called. It's fun.
Jasper Jones Bale, 88.1 FM WPEB, Philadelphia.
Hi.
Thank you for your work. You've included some of the Hollywood Jim Crow issues. My question is, Dr. Marianne Igurga came here and she actually wrote a book, Hollywood Jim Crow. My question to you is, her solution that she came up with, because it's really structural racism, is for the non-white performers to perform a cooperative. Have you heard any discussion of that?
For the non-white performers to perform
A actors cooperative so they can fund their own films?
I mean, I think that's a great idea, but I will also say that historically, that's something that was done, and so people in the golden era wound up again on a shadow track where there were films that, and it's a different world now, so hopefully that would not be the case, but certainly, you know, Hollywood has kept African American performers on such a shadow track by making African American films. For example, I mean, MGM films and so many films that then were not distributed widely. And so that would be my only concern. I would definitely want to make sure that those films were distributed widely so that everyone could see them.
Well, that's not an issue anymore. The internet solves that problem.
That's true. Although, I guess the question then would be, would people go looking for them? Know to go looking for them? I would want to see something actually that somebody said in the book is that, you know, so many African American audience members have been saying for decades, you know, give us our superhero and we will show up. And finally, Black Panther, it happened and we showed up. And when we say give us a superhero, we mean the way everybody else has a superhero. We mean give us the funding, give us the budget, give us the special effects, give us the promotion, give us the tours. And I think that that's important.
I think it's an interesting question about the internet. So there, in the silent era, there was a really active Black independent film. Yeah.
We used to do that at my college. We used to have a film festival dealing with all of those people, Michelle McCall, all
Exactly.
those people, and the Black Cowboys.
Right.
I mean, yeah, Julie
And,
Dash did that, right?
And
In LA.
it starts to disappear with the sound era because it becomes more expensive to produce films, so it's harder to be an independent filmmaker. But also, you just get a really kind of top-down system where, in order to have the technology and the distribution, you know, only very few companies start to make films that the whole world sees. Right? So 99% of films across the globe are made in Los Angeles and Hollywood. And then the question. No, that's the question. Is like, has that changed now or not? I think the jury's still out. Does the mainstream media?
Google came up with they should form a cooperative and fund their own films.
Well, what do you think? What do you think about the idea of a cooperative?
I'm actually working on it.
Oh, that's fantastic. Really? Well, I'm so glad you told us about it, right? The more people who know, the better. So we can all spread the word and we can all see your films. Have you started making any yet, or are you in the early stages?
Just got the negotiation settled. Have you heard of Uptown Theater?
Sure. Is that
In Philadelphia, that's where all the big-time performers that are internationally known would come that were non-white. And so they figured after 20 years, they actually talked to me, and so I convinced them that what we should do is form a cooperative and take and archive all of their performances and offer it up on the internet.
So can you tell us so we'll all know and go check them out? What's the website
It's going to
called?
be a while.
Okay. All right. Do we know yet what the website will be?
It's a $500,000 project.
Okay.
I don't have $500,000 yet.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, we'll keep an eye out for it so that we'll know about it. Thank you for telling us.
Yes. And where's the mic? Oh, yeah.
I'm so
Yes.
close. It doesn't- Now you can hear me. Thank you. Yeah. Hi. Thank you so much for doing this. As a young film student, I'm curious to hear what it was that sparked your interest in this career and in these topics, and what you hope for a book like this one to teach young generations of filmmakers, and in particular female filmmakers.
Okay. Again, I think it was probably reading Molly Haskell and realizing, because I always had a sense that something wasn't quite right. If you watch, for example, if you watch the films of any decade, you'll see instances of racism, of sexism. You'll see all these things that we're now so much more aware of, and yet nobody was really talking about them, even in movies that are iconic. And I just thought, well, that doesn't feel right, but nobody's talking about it. And then I read Molly, and I was like, oh, people are talking about it. It's just that people aren't talking about the people talking about it. And so I wanted to be one of the people talking about it, I guess, is how I would say it. And I do think that you are, do you want to be a filmmaker, or do you want to study film?
I think filmmaker.
Amazing. So, to see young women becoming filmmakers, what could be better than that? I really think your generation is going to change the whole picture and bring us back to where we started, which is a freedom that we haven't had for decades, so that everybody's voice can be heard.
So actually thinking about these two questions together. What about being a critic in the internet age? When the whole, is everyone a critic? How has it changed?
So I happen to believe very strongly that everyone is a critic. We all have opinions, and we're all, especially with movies, willing to share them, right? Yes, we've studied film, and we've studied film theory, and that's important, and it's nice. It's also especially nice to know history. So I would say, for anybody who did want to be a critic, really the most important thing isn't studying film theory. I hope that's okay to say, but like studying film, actually watching films and seeing, what's been made so far. But the truth is, people know what's good. They know what's bad. They know what they like. So I feel like, yes, let's open it up to everybody. I'd like to hear more opinions. Because again, that goes back to the more voices there are, and that's true with a cooperative too. The more voices there are, the better. It can only be good for everybody.
How many films do you watch a year?
Yeah.
Do you keep track?
Yeah. Well, when I was at the Daily News, that was my full-time job, I would see about 400 films a year, I would say. Maybe more. We do several a week, and then at film festivals, you see like several a day. Yeah. There's one movie called Movie 43 by the Farrelly Brothers. And when I wrote the review, I actually tallied up how many movies I'd seen approximately so that I could start my review by saying, in the last 10 years, I've seen 4,500 movies, and I could confidently say Movie 43 is the worst of them all. So.
Yeah. And then tell us about your jury work and judging work for festivals.
Oh, yeah. I love that. That's one of my favorite things that I do, because there's so many young filmmakers or new filmmakers who are doing things that hopefully will get out, into the bigger world, but at the very least, like, have a place to be nurtured. And it's so nice when I highly recommend anyone who's interested in filmmaking, go to a film festival, even just to see what it's like, and just to be around that kind of energy and creativity, because the sad truth is that the industry strips so much of that away. And again, you can get the sense, for example, if you go out to LA, you can get the sense, oh my God, this is impossible. How am I ever going to do this? But if you go to a film festival and you see all these incredible filmmakers of all ages with all kinds of voices and perspectives, you say, oh yeah, I could totally do this.
And do you see things changing of wider diversity of filmmakers, of stories?
Oh yeah, there is such a wider diversity of filmmakers. When I started going to Sundance or Toronto, which are two of the biggest film festivals, really the perspective was so limited, and when there was another perspective, it would almost always like be in the midnight section, or avant-garde voices, and now voices are voices, and I think film festivals are actually kind of at the forefront of saying that every perspective and every voice is important. And, if you call one voice alternative, then what are you saying? Well, then this voice is the mainstream. And who gets to decide that, really? So yes, I think that film festivals are a great place to see that happening now. Has anyone here gone? I know Philadelphia has some great festivals. Have you guys gone to the film festivals here? And you see stuff, right, that you just can't see in theaters from first run, and sometimes they're so much better, right? They feel more authentic. They haven't been written and rewritten, and people aren't worried about sort of reaching the biggest audience. They want to just say what they want to say and reach the right audience for them. So.
Yeah. I mean, it's become kind of what the art house movie theater scene used to look like.
Yes.
It's a separate distribution system.
Yes.
Films are made just for festivals.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's true. And I think that festival curators are really very thoughtful now about how they're choosing films and curating them. And that, too, is absolutely for the best for us.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you so much for coming.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you. Oh, and also, I have cards, which I'll put up here, because if anybody has any other questions, or if you want to know what movies you should see or anything like that, feel free. If you're making a movie and you want to show it to me, I'd love to see it. So feel free to reach out.